Welcome to Tales of Eldelórne. I'm your host, Karleigh. Join me every week as we travel the land of Angeli with our friends Roevash, Fionna, and Hîdh. Cross your fingers for luck because you never know what's around the next corner. If you're a first-time listener, you might want to go back to the beginning because it's a chronological series, and I wouldn't want you to miss a thing. Today's episode of Tales of Eldelórne is Chapter 18, Clarion Call. In the dim candlelit room, Hîdh looked so peaceful as he pressed his sleepy face into his brother's upper arm. Fionna just stared at him as she wondered what growing up with Ro and Hîdh would have been like. She tried to imagine a sea of eidolon faces in a woodland village, going about their daily business. Everyone probably would have been the same and looked a lot like Hîdh, she thought. Ro must have seemed like a tall shadow among them. Hîdh would stand out as well, or maybe odd eyes were a common thing among elves. Fionna sighed, feeling sleepy. She was puzzled as to why a village could be so unkind. I'll have to ask about that in the morning. Humans have a hard time with Hîdh's strange-colored eyes as well. Fionna smiled to herself. To complicate things, he didn't feel the need to hide his ears or the fact that he was eidolon. And just as Hîdh had warned her, the men could not tell if he was male or female. They trusted Fionna, so they had to believe her when she assured them Hîdh was indeed the commander's younger brother. How different life could be, feeling so sure of oneself, Fionna said, as she drifted off, dreaming of noisy villages and elven kin. The three elves fell into the deep silence of healing slumber. Their bodies did not move for many days. The attendants started to be concerned, wondering if they should force them to wake. Instead, they let them be for the time being and checked for breathing and heartbeats around the clock. Fionna was the first to wake. She blinked her eyes wide, unsure of where she was for the moment. She asked for water as she pushed herself up into a sitting position on the edge of the bed. The guard blushed as he poured the drink into a glass and brought it to her. She was suddenly glad a soldier was posted there as she gulped down the cool liquid. Her being naked was another matter as she glared at the young man. He quickly turned around. He grabbed one of Ro's old shirts that hung on the back of the door and awkwardly held it out for her, all the while trying to keep his eyes averted. "Is there something I should know, Fionna?" Roevash lay flat on his back, still unable to move. Fionna was startled to hear the familiar rumble of Ro's voice as he spoke to her in the common tongue. "Are we somehow kin, or should I be curious to find you in my bed?" "We are betrothed." Fiona's words came out in a garbled whisper as she struggled with buttoning up the front of the oversized shirt. Roevash's left brow moved upward. "What?" He closed his eyelids, groaning from the discomfort of any physical movement. "I mean to say Hîdh and I are betrothed," Fionna said meekly. Her forehead cringed in concern at the pain she had just caused him. Good. Embarrassment would be too much work right now. Roevash labored to breathe as he spoke. Be still, my brother, Eiglum said, half asleep. You had a punctured lung and many bones broken. This cannot be quickly mended. Roe's voice spoke in his mother's tongue, as for the first time in centuries he could see his family in his mind's eye. Long have I prayed to the Lords to hear my brother's voice by my side and feel his comfort against my skin. EJ smiled and winked at Fionna, and she blushed back at him. Did you know, big brother? Fionna is a wizard. She is not like Eldelórne as we understand them to be. EJ gently teased, changing the subject for Fionna's sake. I know. There is much we will need to teach her. He gasped for air, barely able to contain the joy he felt bursting in his chest. Fionna looked at Roevash through the side of her eye. Is it okay for me to remove myself to the washroom, or is there something more you need from me? Fionna asked Roevash, trying to remain civil against their silliness. I'm sure of it, EJ agreed, answering his brother, his eyes playfully narrowing as he smiled at Fionna. I'm here, right in the bed, listening, Fionna informed them. She tried to break into their conspiratory banter, but after getting no response, Fionna shook her head and decided to leave them scheming to themselves. God's never ending, she stumbled out of the bed on surprisingly wobbly legs. The guard jumped forward to catch Fionna before she fell. Only halfway back from death, and together they are just like little boys. I swear, Fionna mumbled loudly as she tromped away towards her private rooms. How long was I out? She asked. The man whispered something, and she let out a tiny shriek of shock as she focused on getting to the restroom. I love when she does that, Eiglum beamed proudly. I am so delighted. Fionna is yours, brother. Roe's brow furrowed a little as he tried to keep from laughing. His body gripped him in nauseating pain. He let out a moan. EJ reached up, gently patting Roe on the shoulder. Neither one of them wanted to move, so the brothers fell back into the healing slumber. The line of devastation raged forth as the sorcerer Sermanos' mutant legions swept out across the land. They were killing and eating everything in their path. The rangers fought the huge Hîdh mutant ogres along the edges of the dark mountain range. They cut down many small bands and stragglers who meant to join the greater army, lessening their numbers as best they could. The tower of Hîdh has been brought down and the wizard destroyed, Karleigh announced to his men. It is not a comfort that the wizards fight among themselves, Roevash commented, busying himself with sharpening the edge of his sword while resting in front of the campfire. Just the one they called Torsion, his uncle said excitedly. He was found to be consorting with Sermanos. The others, all the wizards, have blessed this day and joined the sight of men to end this filthy war. That is indeed good news, Roevash said, looking up at Uncle Karleigh. Men's voices in the camp mumbled quietly to each other, mulling over their commander Karleigh's news. Uncle, tell me again, Roe said, the meaning of your second name. Karleigh smiled as he took another gulp of ale and sat down. He was always happy to discuss family with Roevash. The Darjeeling always hold second names as a matter of title, Karleigh replied. The name Isokian is the estate where your father and I were born. The land is a high acreage that hangs above a rich valley far to the northwest in the Scald Mountains. It was once called the land of Iso-Oki for the noisy river that flows through the place. It falls into a valley below and ends at the ocean edge. Kaelin looked soft as he reminisced. We even own a port and a small fleet of trade ships. Something to look forward to when all this fighting ends. Kaelin grinned and swung his tankard at Roevash. A salute to family. Roevash felt a sad pang inside as he said it. They clanked metal together and drank. Roevash wished he'd kept his mouth shut. Here they were, only hours away from battle. All their chances for happiness could be blotted out of existence on this day. Roe's hearing faded as he thought of his failure to find Eidhlum. All this time I fought on the edge of true death. I cannot even think of such peace. He frowned deeply. Fighting, always fighting. Roe was jolted back as Kaelin spoke. The word Ian was added to the end. As you know, in the Elvish tongue, that means son of. My brother and I are sons of that beautiful place, as were all our fathers before us, and you as well. Kaelin smiled at his nephew. He continued by reciting the long record of his lineage. Roe watched as his uncle's face lit up at the memories of such a place. He buried his own feelings of loss and guilt, putting them aside for another time. I wish for you to visit there someday, Roevash. You are the only heir, and the estate would be yours if you so choose it. You could even call yourself by our second name if you so desire. It is rightfully yours as your father's son. Roe could only smile weakly as he picked up his father's sword again to inspect it for signs of wear. Do Edelin have second names? Kaelin looked at Roe expectantly. Not as such. Well, sometimes. The names our mothers give us can change throughout time. Names are influenced by deeds of bravery, prowess with weapons, and sometimes just for handsome demeanor. Roevash said shyly, I would never have to suffer the latter one. He grinned at Kaelin through his unkempt hairy face. He rubbed his beard, feeling like he'd been camping out in the wilderness way too long. Oh, my boy, you break the hearts of women by just one single gaze upon you. Do you not see it in their eyes? Kaelin laughed, much to Roe's delight. Moments of levity were so few these days. It is something to consider, good uncle, Roe said. And then he saw a teasing look flash in his uncle's eyes. Roe quickly added, I mean to say I think I would like to see someday the place where my father and beloved uncle would call home. Roe sat with a smirk on his face, knowing they were not going to let him off so easily on the topic of women. Hey, Sir Roevash, I know my sister would fancy some private time with ye. A younger man named Jonas shouted across the fire pit. Then we could drink as brothers-in-law. He wagged his eyebrows, and the whole encampment started hooting and roaring in laughter. Roevash just bashfully grinned at the man. I am still too young for such things as women. Suddenly, the whole place went dead silent. The guys in their fun could hardly believe Roevash had never known the comfort of a woman. A whoop went up as they vowed to remedy that in the very next town they came near. They couldn't see the blush on Roe's face in the dim campfire light as he busied himself polishing his sword. You are half Darjeeling, Kaelin asked his nephew in real curiosity. Does that not count for anything in such matters? Then he leaned in to speak privately, as he quietly confessed, even I have felt the tenderness of a good woman now and then. Roevash tried not to look shocked. He just smiled and shook his head, not knowing what to say. He liked it better when he wasn't the center of attention. Roevash looked up just in time to see the signal on the mountain range suddenly blaze into the dark skyline. So, the sorcerer's craving for domination upon all of Angeli has begun in earnest. Roe grimly stood up. He sheathed his weapon into its scabbard and buckled it over his left shoulder. The men solemnly looked on into the thick boiling darkness that had covered the sun and turned the day into night. Roevash could feel his skin crawl at the smell of the thick air that was filled with an evil stench. In the distance he could hear the drums of the organized march as it began. "To war!" his uncle cried out to the men, and they all rose up to fight. After another night of healing sleep, Roevash was still frail, but he was able to sit up for a short time. He only had enough strength to take a few sips of water and then fell back into the slumber. This is how Fionna learned Edelyn would not take food during this time, which was the opposite of how humans handle convalescence. Fionna suffered from the thought that she was most likely the reason EJ had experienced so much illness when he came back into this realm. In her ignorance, she kept stuffing him with soup. He was still in a stupor, and he was too polite and incapacitated to communicate, so he just swallowed everything she gave him on a spoon. Fionna felt just horrible. She was in shock at what she had done. She decided it would be best if she stayed away for a while. EJ is better at this kind of thing than me, she tried convincing herself. The sadness of stark loneliness was slowly washing over her. Fionna lay down, but the bed felt hard. The bedclothes felt rough. The blankets were too heavy. She threw them aside, flailing her legs in the air. She rolled over again, trying to be comfortable. After staring for what seemed like hours at the flickering embers of the fireplace, Fionna could almost feel the bags growing under her eyes. She decided it probably wouldn't hurt to check on the brothers. "How did I ever sleep alone before?" she grumbled to herself as she rolled to a sitting position on the side of her bed. She pulled on a cloak for the walk across the yard back to Roe's private quarters. The brothers were sleeping soundly. Roevash was well enough that he had turned on his side, and Eiglum cuddled up along his back. At first sight, they seemed like complete opposites. EJ was so much smaller and more delicately built than the big man. Then, upon closer inspection, Fionna could see the same curve to the lips and ears. Their foreheads were high, noble proportions, and they both had strong curves to the jawline. She thought to herself how Roe's eyes were the same pale crystal blue as EJ's blue eye. She wondered if their mother had blue eyes. That is just another one of many questions that need to be answered, Fionna said to herself. "You are feeling alone," EJ sleepily whispered from the bed, pulling Fionna from her thoughts. "Come to me," he urged, putting out a hand to encourage her. Fionna hesitated, but his face was serious. She was glad to see the guard had given up and moved out of the room to do other duties. "I do not want to hurt him," she whispered, as if she could. "You are a strange one." EJ smiled, as he nestled her into his arms and kissed her on the nose. They lay curled up together against Roe's warm back. Fionna could feel the soft rumble of quiet snoring. "I cannot believe how much I miss you, EJ." Fionna was almost in tears. "The yearning to touch makes you elven. Do not fight it so." EJ chuckled as he put his arm around her. Fionna felt instantly safe and at peace, pressed between the brothers' warm bodies. "EJ is right," were her last thoughts as she fell soundly asleep. The sound of 1,000 voices and clashing weapons echoed across the fields where already another 10,000 lay dead or dying. Roevash tried to keep an eye on his uncle, but he had lost him after many hours of battle. The stench of the Hîdh made him want to gasp for breath, but he knew better than to open his mouth when there was so much filth in the air. He felt his muscles start to fatigue, so he fought his way to the side of the field to find some rest in a tree line when he heard a familiar voice. It was the young ranger dhîn, who was his uncle's squire. He was standing over someone who was wounded and on his knees. It was Roe's uncle Karleigh, trying in vain not to fall to the ground. Roevash worked desperately through the clamor of fighting to get to them when a sinister shadow rose up from behind the two. Roevash could only watch in stunned horror as his uncle, impaled through his back on a giant pike, was lifted off the ground into the air, like a trophy to be won. dhîn had just fought off the smaller creature that wounded Karleigh. He twisted, and with all his might, his long sword beheaded the massive fiend in one motion. But his action came too late. The whole scene collapsed to the ground as dhîn caught an enemy blade across the face and was thrown on his back into a pile of bloody corpses. A sudden pulsing silence fell over the battlefield as the shock of what he just witnessed broke Roe's concentration. The pounding sound of his own heartbeat hissed loudly in his ears. His body went numb as his mouth shouted out something his mind did not understand. Sensing a warrior's weakness, an enormous Hîdh turned its eyes upon him. Roevash was about to engage in what would be the final struggle of his long, miserable life. Blood-stained and wild-eyed, Roevash roared until he felt every fiber of his body stretch and burn with readiness. He glowered at the monster. And then Roevash lowered his sword. Standing motionless, he was unable or unwilling to defend himself. The bleating of a giant horn shook the ground as it sounded in thick waves across the smoke-filled air. Roevash looked up. The attention of the field suddenly riveted on the black fortress. The sorcerer's final tower succumbed to flames and burst from its side like a giant gutted serpent as it fell. Stone and mortar sprayed out over the battlefield, taking out its last victims of the hideous long war. The mutant armies, no longer influenced by the sorcerer's dark magics, dropped their weapons and ran from the field. A shout went up from the ranks of men who had just defeated their enemy. The triumphant noise drowned out the sounds of grief as Roevash held the body of his uncle, clutched in his arms. I have no words for the grief Roevash felt at the loss of his uncle. Karleigh was the last of his kin, and because elven life is so long, Roevash would be forced to live for centuries in the desolation of the mortal realm. The dark days of grief is always a hard thing, no matter where you are from. With our own recent plague of COVID-19, the whole planet is united in grief at the loss of tens of thousands. My hope for the future is that humanity will learn something from this, that like the elves, we are stronger together. Stay safe out there. Elvish lesson of the day. Na melana sahlin, imma abelas, nínion gurth dhîn, Hîdh. Vull sulahn'nehn, dirthera, samahl, numin, lath, Vull. You have just witnessed an Edelin eulogy written in Sindarin Elvish. The translation is, "Your time is come. Now I am filled with sorrow. I weep for your death. Find peace, my beloved, as I sing, rejoice. I tell the tales. I laugh and cry. And I love one more day."